Okay, so have you ever felt like, the U.S. government is like this giant, complicated machine?
Yeah, for sure. It can definitely be overwhelming trying to understand how it all works.
Exactly. But that's why we're here today, right?
Absolutely.
We're doing a deep dive into the structure of the U.S. government, and we're using this concise guide as our source material.
Sounds good.
And the goal here is to really help you guys understand the structure in a way that makes you feel empowered and not just like giving you a bunch of facts, you know?
Yeah, I think a lot of times people hear about government and they just shut down.
Yeah, they're like, oh, that's boring.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
But it's really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And it's so important for all of us to understand, right?
Absolutely. I think it's really all about informed citizens being the backbone of a strong democracy.
Right. And that's kind of like a cliche, you know?
Absolutely.
But what does that even mean? Like, how does understanding all this, like the branches and the amendments and all that, how does that translate into me having a voice and making a difference, you know?
Well, you have to understand the rules of the game to play it right.
Right.
So this is like giving you the rule book so you can actually get in there and advocate for the issues you care about and hold your elected officials accountable.
So it's like less about memorizing facts and more about understanding how those facts impact our lives and give us the tools to participate.
Exactly. It's all about how power flows and how you fit into the equation.
I like that. So one thing that surprised me getting ready for this was this whole concept of federalism.
Oh,
It's like we have this system where power is shared between the national and state governments.
yeah. And that's one of the things that really sets us apart from a lot of other countries.
Okay, so how does that work? Like in real life, how does this power sharing play out?
Well, think about things like driver's licenses or um, marriage laws, even education policies.
Hmm.
These are all areas where states have a lot of power because of federalism.
So states can kind of make up their own rules on all sorts of things.
Well, there's definitely some variation from state to state, which is why you see different approaches to issues like gun control or healthcare. But that's the beauty of it, right? It allows for flexibility.
Right, so it's like this balance between national unity and then states having their own autonomy.
Exactly. The
Yeah.
federal government sets some basic standards, and then states can tailor things to their specific needs.
So to understand how it all works, we need to break down the structure, right?
Yeah.
And both the federal government and state governments are based on this three-branch system,
Yeah, the three branches.
which always seemed confusing to me. Like, why three?
Well, it's really brilliant when you think about it because it's all about making sure that power is divided up. The founding fathers were really concerned about tyranny, so they didn't want any one person or group to have too much power.
So it's like a three-legged stool. You need all three legs for it to be stable.
Perfect analogy. And those three legs are the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch.
Okay, and each branch has its own job.
Exactly. And they're designed to act as checks and balances on each other.
So no one branch can get too powerful because the other two are there to keep them in check.
You got it.
Okay, so let's start with the executive branch. What's its main function?
Well, at the federal level, the executive branch is headed by the president, who is responsible for carrying out and enforcing the laws that Congress makes.
Right, so the president is kind of like the CEO of the country. What about the vice president and all those cabinet members we hear about?
So the vice president is there to take over if something happens to the president.
Okay.
And they also preside over the Senate.
Hmm.
And then the cabinet is made up of the heads of all the major departments.
So they're like the experts in different areas.
Yeah, they advise the president on policy and run their own departments.
So a pretty big job. What about making the laws? That's where the legislative branch comes in, right?
Or that's Congress.
With the House of Representatives and the Senate. Why are there two parts to Congress?
It's all about balance, right? The House is meant to be super responsive to what people want right now.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, each state gets a certain number of representatives based on its population, so bigger states have more representatives,
Makes sense.
and they only serve 2-year terms. So they're always thinking about what their voters want back home.
So it's like they have to keep their finger on the pulse of what people are thinking right now.
Exactly.
So if the House is all about what people want right now, what's the Senate's role?
The Senate is more about taking a long-term view. Each state, no matter how big or small, gets 2 senators,
Oh.
and they serve 6-year terms, so they can think about the bigger picture.
So while the House is all like, what do people want right now? The Senate is like, hold on, what about the long-term consequences?
You got it. That's why those big, complicated bills we hear about, like for infrastructure or climate change, often take years to pass. Senators are thinking about the impact for decades to come.
That makes a lot of sense. I'd never thought of it that way. So we've got the legislative branch making the laws, but what happens once a law is actually passed? Where does it go from there?
Well, it goes to the president's desk,
Oh, yeah.
and the president can either sign it,
Right.
make it a law, or veto it.
And send it back to Congress. So that's a way that the executive branch checks the power of the legislative branch.
Exactly. That's one of the checks and balances in action.
Right. It's like they're constantly keeping each other in line.
Yep. Which is important when you're talking about running a whole country.
So we've covered the executive and legislative branches, which leaves us with the third leg of the stool, the judicial branch.
Right. The judicial branch.
What do they do?
They interpret the laws
Yeah.
and make sure they line up with the Constitution,
Yeah, right.
which is like the ultimate rule book of the United States.
Right.
And the big player here is the Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court, with the 9 justices
Yep.
that are appointed for life.
For life.
I always thought that was a big deal, but I never understood why.
Well, it's a big deal because it means they don't have to worry about elections or political pressure.
Okay.
They can just focus on the law.
So they're like referees.
Yeah, exactly. They're the referees of the government, making sure everyone is playing by the rules.
I like that.
And one of their most powerful tools is judicial review.
Judicial review. Remind me what that is.
So that's the power of the Supreme Court to say that a law passed by Congress or even something the president did is unconstitutional.
Whoa. So they can actually overturn a law.
Yeah, they can.
That's a lot of power.
It is. And it's another one of those checks and balances that keeps everything in check.
So even the president and Congress have to answer to the Supreme Court.
Exactly. It all goes back to the Constitution.
Wow. I'm starting to see how this whole system is designed.
It's pretty brilliant, right?
It is. It's like all these checks and balances, all these different branches with their own roles, but they all have to work together.
Yeah.
It's kind of beautiful when you think about it.
Yeah, it is.
But what about state governments? We hear so much about what's going on in Washington, D.C., that it's easy to forget that state governments even exist.
Right. But they're actually way more connected to our daily lives than we realize.
Really?
They handle things like education, healthcare, transportation, all kinds of stuff.
So while the federal government is debating the big national issues, state governments are dealing with stuff that affects us every day.
Exactly.
That makes sense. So do state governments have that same 3-branch structure?
They do. Each state has its own executive, legislative, and judicial branches, just like the federal government.
Wow. So it's like a mini version of the federal government.
Exactly. And this is where that 10th Amendment we talked about comes in.
The 10th Amendment.
Remember, it basically says that any powers that aren't specifically given to the federal government are reserved for the states or the people.
Ah, okay. I remember.
So that's why states have so much control over things like education and healthcare.
So it's because the Constitution doesn't specifically say those are federal powers. So they go to the states by default.
Yep.
That's so interesting. So what are some of those like hot button issues that are actually decided at the state level?
Oh gosh, tons of them. Things like abortion access, the environment, how elections are run, even things like whether or not to legalize marijuana.
Wow. So depending on where you live in the U.S., your experience with these issues could be totally different.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to be informed about what's happening at the state level as well as the federal level. Your vote and your voice matter a lot.
That's a really good point. It's easy to feel like we're just spectators in all of this.
Yeah, I get that.
We actually have a lot more influence than we think.
Absolutely. This is a democracy, after all. It's designed for citizens to have a say.
So voting is a big one, obviously, but what are some other ways that we can actually make our voices heard? Because sometimes it feels like those elected officials are kind of off in their own world, you know?
Well, they are supposed to be representing us. So reaching out to them directly is actually one of those effective things you can do. Let them know what you care about. Ask them questions. It's their job to listen.
Oh, that's a good point. It's easy to forget that they work for us.
Yeah.
What about those advocacy groups?
Advocacy groups are great because they bring people together who are passionate about a specific issue so they can organize and make their voices heard.
So it's like strength in numbers.
Exactly. And sometimes even just talking to people in your community about these issues can help.
So it's about recognizing that we're all part of this system.
Absolutely. And that we all have a role to play in making it work.
But with all these different levels of government and all these branches and all these different ways to get involved, it still feels kind of overwhelming. Where do we even begin?
Well, I'd say the first step is just to pay attention. Stay informed about what's going on in your community, your state, and at the national level. Read the news, listen to podcasts.
So it's about being curious.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to start small.
What do you mean by start small?
Well, you don't have to tackle some huge national issue right away.
Mm.
Maybe just attend a town hall meeting or volunteer at a local organization or even just have a conversation with a friend about something you care about.
So just find some way to plug into the system.
Exactly. Every little bit helps.
I have to admit, when we first started talking about this deep dive, I was kind of nervous. Government structure. It sounded kind of boring.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
But this has actually been fascinating.
I'm glad.
It's like a puzzle where all the pieces are starting to fit together.
I agree. And it's a puzzle worth solving because it affects all of us. It's the framework for our whole society.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot here.
We have.
But before we wrap up, let's do a quick recap to make sure everyone's got the key takeaways.
Okay, sounds good.
So we started by talking about federalism, which is that idea of dividing power between the federal government and state governments. And then we talked about how both the federal government and each state government have that three-branch structure with the executive, legislative, and judicial branches.
And those checks and balances that keep them all in line.
Yes, that's so important. And we talked about the 10th Amendment, which is why states have so much control over things like education and healthcare.
And of course, we can't forget about the importance of citizen participation.
Yeah.
Voting, getting involved, making your voice heard.
Yeah, that's how we make this whole democracy thing work.
Yeah.
Our source material mentions this organizational chart that shows the whole structure of the U.S. government.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
I think seeing it all laid out visually could really help.
Definitely.
We'll be sure to include a link to that in the show notes.
Perfect.
Okay, so before we go, I have one final thought for everyone to ponder.
Okay, hit me.
Now that we've kind of gotten this foundation of how the government works, what are you most curious about? Like, what do you want to learn more about?
That's a good question. Is there like a specific branch of government you want to dig into more? Or
Yeah, or a particular, like, policy area?
Yeah, or maybe the history of how we got here.
Ooh, yeah, the history's fascinating.
Right.
I gotta admit, I'm feeling really inspired to, like, learn more about how things work at the state level.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, maybe I'll actually go to one of those town hall meetings I keep hearing about.
I think that'd be awesome.
Ah,
Sometimes we get so caught up in the national stuff that we forget about what's happening in our own backyards.
yeah, totally. It's all about recognizing that change starts small, right?
Yeah.
We all have the power to make a difference.
Yeah, like that ripple effect.
Yeah.
Even a small action can have a big impact.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so speaking of impact, I think we should touch on the Bill of Rights.
The Bill of Rights, yeah.
It's like the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, those are the ones that guarantee our basic freedoms.
Right, and those are important.
They are important. It's easy to forget how crucial they are.
It's like having a shield that protects us from the government overstepping its bounds.
Right. And those rights apply no matter what state you live in.
Exactly. A national safety net for our freedoms.
Yeah, it's like they're woven into the fabric of who we are as a country.
Totally.
It's up to all of us to make sure those rights are protected.
For sure, for ourselves and for future generations.
All right, so I think that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the U.S. government structure.
Wow, that was a lot.
It was a lot,
Uh-huh.
but hopefully it was helpful, you guys.
Yeah.
I feel a lot more informed now.
Me too. It's been fun exploring all this with you.
Yeah, it has. So just remember, knowledge is power.
Yes, it is.
And the more we understand about how our government works, the more we can shape the future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So keep learning, keep questioning, and get involved.
Yes.
And don't forget to check out that organizational chart we mentioned. It's a great way to see the whole structure laid out visually. You can find a link to it in the show notes.
Perfect.
Okay, so until next time, keep diving deep.
See ya.